Welcome back to part two of Washington's administration as we continue looking at the early republic. As Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton had issued three reports, one on public credit or debt, one on banking, and one on manufacturing. Now, when it came to discussing debt, uh, Hamilton thought that some debt was okay. It showed that people had trust in the government to invest in it. Well, at this point, we had federal and state debts, much of it which was kind of left over from the Revolutionary War. In fact, we owed money to countries, to soldiers, and even to citizens. Now, what Hamilton believes is that even what we had in 1790 was a debt of about $54 million, and he proposed that we pay off that debt in full, whereas some people wanted us to just kind of forget it and just say that we wouldn't pay it off. But to try to show that we were a good risk for investing in, and to encourage other countries and people to loan us money in the future, he wanted to pay it off at full value. In fact, he also wanted the federal government to assume the state's debt. And what that would do is it would kind of show that the federal government reigned supreme and reduce the power of the individual states a little bit. So, under his plan of assumption, the federal government would pay off the state debts. Now, some fiscally responsible states didn't like this idea. They thought, why should they help other states pay off their debts? Well, what ends up happening is that the federal government does assume the state debts, and with the agreement that the capital would be moved further south, eventually located at Washington, D.C., which would kind of appease the Southerners a little bit. In Hamilton's second report in 1791, this one, his report on the National Bank, he puts forth his arguments of why the government should create a national bank, one that would be privately owned. And what he kind of sees is that he uses the Constitution and the implied powers, or his loose interpretation of the Constitution, as justification for creating this bank. Now, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison both disagreed with this, as they were more of a strict interpretationists. Madison also didn't like it because he thought that it would benefit the rich more than it would others, and that sometimes banks could become maybe corrupting, or kind of favor some people at the expense of others. And so both Jefferson and Madison disagreed with this national bank. However, we eventually do see the creation of a national bank. And finally, in Hamilton's third report on manufacturing, he believed that it was kind of government's job to help stimulate industry and manufacturing, and not be so reliant maybe upon other countries. And so he kind of comes out with ways that the government can help that, whether it be maybe through subsidies or higher tariffs or whatnot. But here again, Thomas Jefferson and Madison both disagree with him once again, kind of arguing states' rights and against too strong of a federal government. Not only that, but Jefferson talks about how cities, looking back at Europe or England, sometimes became overcrowded, kind of disease-ridden, or just a lot of problems inside cities that had a lot of manufacturing, and therefore he was against this idea of helping to stimulate United States manufacturing. Now, in the late 1700s, France was going through its own revolution. Now, as you might recall, Hamilton kind of tended to favor the British, whereas Thomas Jefferson sided with the French. Well, however, at this time, the British were kind of impressing our sailors. They weren't granting full trading rights with us. Not to mention that they hadn't totally removed all their troops from the Northwest Territory, and were even blockading the French ports, which made it tough for us to trade with the French. And so during this time, there's kind of a lot of reasons not to really want to side with the British. However, the French at the same time were encouraging American vessels to raid British ships. They had become kind of more radical and sent thousands upon thousands of their own countrymen to their deaths through the use of the guillotine, and eventually even see their king and queen sent to the guillotine as well. And so we kind of were steering this path of neutrality, something that Washington firmly believed in, was to not pick a side and kind of stay a more neutral route. But what we see is with the growing tensions with Britain, that in 1794, George Washington sends John Jay over to try to negotiate a treaty with the British, as some of those standing problems that I've already mentioned still existed. Issues like, we're going to try to get the English to remove their troops, give us payments for ships that they had taken in the past, and just general improvement in our commercial interests abroad. However, as Hamilton is one to want to have good relations with the British, he actually warns them that we're willing to compromise on most basically, every issue. And therefore, he doesn't really accomplish a lot with this treaty. Jay doesn't. He does get the English to leave some of the forts, and he does get some small ship trading approved. But the other issues, whether it be like neutral rights at sea, the impressment of sailors, or payment for ships taken in the past, he doesn't get those. And so Jay's treaty really kind of, doesn't have all the success that Washington had hoped for. We do see some, more success, however, the next year, 1795, with Pinckney's Treaty, also known as the San Lorenzo Treaty. Now, the Spanish were kind of afraid that the U.S. and British might take some of their possessions in America, and so they were willing to negotiate some things in favor of the Americans to try to keep us from looking to expand our boundaries. A couple things that came from this treaty then was one, they agreed to keep the Mississippi River open for trade as they controlled the mouth of New Orleans, and they also allowed us to deposit our goods at New Orleans without any duties. One of the things we feared was if they cut off the Mississippi, Western farmers in Western states wouldn't be able to, trade or get goods to kind of come and go up and down the Mississippi. So this was a big step for the Americans. Another thing it also did was secure a southern boundary of the United States and the Spanish lands. And they also agreed to stay out of Native American affairs in our territories and not, spark any more wars or hostilities between the U.S. and the Native Americans, something that we'd had to have dealt with before. But when we turn our attention to the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, this really kind of shows how far our government had come since the Articles of Confederation. When we saw the failings of Shays' Rebellion and with the government to deal with it, the Whiskey Rebellion is quite different. In 1794, farmers in western Pennsylvania were upset with a tax on whiskey and grains that they used to create the whiskey. And the Pennsylvania governor, who was a Republican, didn't really do anything to try to stop it. So George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and the other Federalists saw this as kind of a direct political challenge to their might and ability to kind of keep the peace. And so probably the only time in our nation's history Washington actually leads his 15,000 men with Hamilton to go to Pennsylvania and put this rebellion down. And once they get there, they really can't find anybody who's kind of up in arms or rebelling, and so it's kind of squashed pretty easily. But what it kind of shows is that we have the beginnings of this Republican versus Federalist ideals and political parties forming, something that Washington had already warned against. But Thomas Jefferson, as you can see, said that an insurrection was announced and proclaimed and armed against, but could never be found. And so it kind of shows the tensions a little bit between how strong of a federal government should we have, and yet how do we protect states' rights, and that delicate balance when we see political parties beginning to form. And in 1796, Washington decides to actually not run for a third term. Even though some people were willing to make him basically a king and let him continue ruling, in September of 1796, he announces that he wouldn't run. Now, when he gives his farewell address, which was written primarily by Hamilton, he discusses several major aspects that he hopes to kind of see shape our nation's future dealings, whether it be domestic or foreign affairs. And this is something we'll explore closer in class. However, as I'd mentioned, since Washington announced so late that he wouldn't run for a third term, it almost guaranteed that John Adams, who was Washington's vice president, would be guaranteed the election in 1796. Because what happened was that Thomas Jefferson, the Democrat Republicans, didn't have much of a chance or much time to kind of mount much of a campaign. So even though Adams and Jefferson worked on the Declaration of Independence together, they're kind of at odds with each other now. And once Adams wins, he basically keeps Washington's cabinet, even though they kind of continue to consult with Hamilton on the side. But as you'll kind of read more about, even though John Adams is a Federalist and wins the presidency, Thomas Jefferson, as a Republican, will be the vice president under some kind of conniving mistakes that Hamilton had made. Something we'll investigate later on.